This is the grave of Fanny Adams. Now, Fanny was an 8-year-old girl who lived here in Alton, and she was brutally murdered by a guy called Frederick and dismembered in a hop field where she was playing.
On a sweltering August afternoon in 1867, the quiet Hampshire market town of Alton seemed like any other. The air was thick with the scent of hops and the hum of summer life. However, that fragile peace was shattered when Thomas Gates, a local laborer and veteran of the Crimean War, stumbled upon a horrifying sight: the mutilated body of 8-year-old Fanny Adams, left in the fields she had once played in. In an instant, innocence and safety were ripped from the town. The tragic and horrifying story of Fanny Adams would not only haunt those who knew her, but would also echo across history. We'll explore the true horror of it all. The horrific discovery. On the morning of Saturday, August 24th, 1867, 8-year-old Fanny Adams left her home on 10 House Lane in Alton to play in the nearby flood meadows. She was accompanied by her 5-year-old sister, Elizabeth, Lizzie, and their close friend, Minnie Warner. It was a familiar routine. Fanny was bright, confident, and older than the others. She led the way, and then, simply, she did not come back. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Harriet Adams, her mother, expected delays. Children lingered. Games ran long, but as the hours stretched on and midday passed, the absence became impossible to ignore. Lizzie returned home. Fanny did not. When asked where her sister was, the child gave vague, halting answers. She had last seen Fanny in the fields, but Lizzie did not immediately say everything she knew, and later, accounts suggest she may not have fully understood what she had witnessed. At 5 years old, her sense of time, danger, and consequence was fragile. Whatever she had seen that morning had frightened her into silence. It was only when a neighbor, Mrs. Gardner, pressed Lizzie more carefully that fragments of the truth began to surface. The girls had been approached by a man while playing in the meadows. He spoke kindly at first. He had offered money. Minnie Warner, sharper or more cautious, had run away. Lizzie followed. Fanny did not. Whether Lizzie saw her sister being physically seized remains unclear, but she knew Fanny had been left behind with the man. That realization struck like a blow. Harriet Adams understood immediately that this was no longer a case of a child wandering off. Harriet and Mrs. Gardner rushed toward the fields, calling Fanny's name again and again as they crossed the uneven ground. The hop fields stretched outward, sunlit and deceptively calm. Every step deepened the dread. Other townspeople began to gather, alerted by the frantic search. Alton, with a population of roughly 3,500 at the time, was small enough that news spread fast. Within hours, the disappearance of Fanny Adams had become the town's singular focus. That night, while the town remained awake with fear, the truth lay hidden in the grass. The following day, Sunday, August 25th, the search resumed at first light. Men fanned out across the countryside. Women gathered at the Adams home. Hope had not yet died, but it was thinning rapidly. It was Thomas Gates, a local laborer and former soldier, who made the discovery. In a hop field not far from where the children had been playing, he came across Fanny Adams's body, brutally mutilated. She had not wandered. She had been murdered. The news hit Alton like an explosion. Harriet Adams, upon hearing the news, was immediately overwhelmed. She attempted to rush to her husband, George Adams, who was playing cricket nearby, but the sight of her daughter's remains and the weight of grief and shock caused her to collapse before reaching him. George, once informed, was consumed by rage. He grabbed his shotgun, determined to confront whoever had committed this unimaginable act, only to be restrained by family and neighbors. In that moment, the entire community was gripped by a combination of horror, anger, and disbelief. In a town where crime was almost non-existent, nothing like this had ever occurred. The very fabric of Alton life had been torn apart. The crime was beyond comprehension, especially because of the victim's age, only 8 years old. In Victorian England, child murders were rare enough to shock, but this one crossed a line that left even hardened observers shaken. The investigation accelerated immediately. The local constabulary was summoned, but even the authorities faced the limitations of 19th century investigative methods. Without modern forensic tools, they relied on eyewitness accounts, careful observation, and the meticulous retracing of the day's events. There was one suspect, though: Frederick Baker. Baker was 29 years old, a solicitor's clerk who had moved to Alton only months earlier. He was educated, well-spoken, and outwardly respectable. He attended church. He wore good clothes. He did not fit the image of a criminal that Victorians were accustomed to fearing, yet multiple witnesses recalled seeing him in the vicinity of the fields that morning. Some remembered him speaking to children. Others noticed his agitation later in the day, his attempts to insert himself into conversations about the search, while subtly steering suspicion elsewhere. Baker's behavior grew more troubling as the hours passed. He claimed to have seen Fanny heading in a different direction. He suggested she may have wandered off alone. He volunteered information unprompted. While Alton was busy searching its fields and lanes, Baker maintained his composure publicly, even as his private actions began to betray him. When the police were called, they searched Baker's lodgings. They found knives, blood-stained clothing. Most damning of all, they found a diary. In it, Baker had written of killing a young girl on August 24th. The entry was disturbingly matter-of-fact. Baker was arrested the same day. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed. In the days that followed, the full weight of what had happened settled over Alton. The fields where children had played became crime scenes. Parents kept their sons and daughters close. Trust, once freely given, evaporated. Lizzie Adams, barely old enough to understand death, carried the burden of survival. Whether she could have spoken sooner, whether it would have changed anything, became questions with no satisfying answers. The murder of Fanny Adams would go on to shock Victorian England, dominate newspaper headlines, and leave a linguistic legacy that stripped her name of its humanity. But in those first days, before trials and executions and slang, it was simply a town in mourning, grappling with the realization that evil had not come from outside. It had walked into the fields with their children, smiled, and never looked like a monster at all. Things hadn't always been this way, of course. Life before the tragedy. In the quiet market town of Alton, Hampshire, life moved at a pace dictated by the seasons, the church bells, and the rhythms of family and community. On April 30th, 1859, George and Harriet Adams welcomed their third child, a daughter who would grow up to be both beloved and, tragically, remembered far beyond her years. They named her Fanny Adams. She was one of 6 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, and from the start, she was known for her bright eyes and quick smile. Fanny was described by those who knew her as tall for her age, intelligent, and always eager to talk to anyone who would listen. The Adams family lived on 10 House Lane, a narrow street in Alton that was tightly woven into the fabric of the town. Across the lane lived Fanny's grandparents, and nearby, Minnie Warner, Fanny's closest friend. In a town with fewer than 5,000 residents in the mid-19th century, everyone was familiar with everyone else, and the children of Alton often played under the watchful eyes of neighbors. Fanny, Minnie, and Lizzie, Fanny's younger sister, were inseparable. They ran through the gardens, chased each other across the flood meadows, and explored the fields that produced hops for Alton's long-standing brewing industry. These fields, often sun-drenched and fragrant with the scent of growing hops, were as familiar to Fanny as her own backyard. The summers in Alton were filled with simple pleasures, climbing trees, collecting flowers, and racing each other across the soft earth of the meadows. Fanny had a curious and adventurous spirit. She would stop to chat with adults she passed, often asking questions or sharing observations about the world around her. Her mother, Harriet, remembered her as a child who loved people, who was quick to smile, and who seemed to bring joy wherever she went. George, meanwhile, often watched his children play with quiet pride. By August 1867, Fanny was 8 years old, a bright and lively child, tall for her age. She and Minnie, along with Lizzie, spent countless hours outdoors. On the morning of August 24th, 1867, Fanny and her companions had been playing in the Adams garden, enjoying the warmth of a typical summer day. Eventually, Fanny suggested they venture to the nearby flood meadow, a green expanse surrounded by hop fields. This had been a familiar place of play for years. Harriet Adams, busy with housework, gave her daughter permission to go. She could not have possibly known what was about to happen. Recounting the sequence of harrowing events. Fanny set off with Minnie and Lizzie, laughing and chattering as they went. The peaceful summer day would not last. As they walked along the narrow lanes leading to the meadow, the girls were approached by a man who had been in Alton only a short time. Frederick Baker wore a black frock coat, a light waistcoat, and a tall hat. He was a solicitor's clerk by profession and had quickly established himself in the town, attending church and mingling socially. To Fanny, Minnie, and Lizzie, he He seemed a familiar, respectable man, but beneath this outwardly respectable appearance lurked a terrifying intent. Baker attempted to persuade Fanny to accompany him to the neighboring village of Sheldon. She refused, choosing to stay with her sister and Minnie. In an effort to bribe her, he offered half a penny, which Fanny also refused. Turning his attention to the other two girls, he offered them 3 half pennies to run an errand for sweets, but they, too, insisted on staying together. Realizing his attempts at persuasion had failed, Baker resorted to violence. He seized Fanny and carried her off into the hop fields, leaving Minnie and Lizzie behind, frozen in shock and disbelief. The girls ran to Minnie's mother, Martha Warner, to report the abduction, but Martha initially assumed the children were exaggerating or playing a prank. You see, such crimes were unheard of in Alton. Minnie, reassured by her mother's calm response, returned to play, while Lizzie eventually went home. By 5 p.m., Fanny had been missing for more than 3 hours. On her way home, Lizzie encountered another neighbor, Mrs. Gardner, who immediately sensed the gravity of the situation and accompanied the 5-year-old back to the Adams home to alert Harriet. We already discussed the rest. Fanny's body was recovered in full after days of careful searching. Each piece was collected and temporarily held at the Leathern Bottle Public House before being taken to the local police station. There, authorities painstakingly reassembled the body. The combination of evidence made the case against Frederick Baker irrefutable. The arrest formalized the start of legal proceedings that would culminate in one of the most notorious trials in Victorian England. Why did he do it? What could this monster possibly have against the little fairy? The grim details surfaced as the trial proceeded. The aftermath. The court convened on December 5, 1867, in the historic city, where Winchester Castle had long served as a judicial center. Baker was formally charged with the abduction and murder of Fanny Adams. From the outset, the courtroom was tense, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of grief and outrage. The townspeople of Alton, many of whom had contributed to the search and witnessed the discovery of Fanny's mutilated body, followed the proceedings closely, as did press representatives eager to document one of the most sensational trials of the decade. Frederick Baker entered the courtroom, appearing calm and composed. His demeanor was unsettling to many, as though he were detached from the gravity of the accusations. From the very beginning, Baker denied any involvement in Fanny's murder, insisting that he had merely been a casual acquaintance of the children and had no motive or reason to harm them. His defense attorneys, aware of the Victorian fascination with insanity as a legal defense, attempted to argue that Baker might be criminally insane. The McNaughton Rules, established in 1843, had formalized the idea that a defendant could be found not guilty if, at the time of the crime, he was incapable of understanding the nature of his act or knowing that it was wrong. Juries were fascinated by madness. Newspapers obsessed over it. Doctors debated it endlessly. And Baker's lawyers leaned into that cultural moment hard. They did not deny that Frederick Baker had killed Fanny Adams. That would have been futile. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and Baker's own written confession removed any remaining doubt. Instead, the defense focused on his mind. They attempted to paint a picture of a man driven by hereditary insanity, overtaken by impulses he could neither control nor fully comprehend. To support this, they introduced claims of mental illness within Baker's family. Testimony suggested that his mother had suffered from periods of mental instability and had, at times, displayed behavior consistent with what Victorians broadly labeled as insanity, a term that could encompass everything from depression to psychosis. There were also references to other relatives whose lives had been marked by mental weakness, nervous disorders, or confinement. The defense argued that madness, like physical disease, could be inherited, passed from parent to child, until it erupted under stress. Baker's attorneys portrayed him as a man who had always been odd, withdrawn, and emotionally unstable. They emphasized his solitary nature, his lack of close relationships, and his apparent inner turmoil. They suggested that the crime was not planned in a rational sense, but was the result of a sudden, uncontrollable mental collapse. But the prosecution dismantled this argument piece by piece. Medical witnesses called by the court testified that while Baker may have exhibited strange or disturbing behavior, there was no evidence that he met the legal definition of insanity. He was not delusional. He did not claim voices commanded him. He did not appear confused about the nature of his actions. On the contrary, everything about the crime suggested awareness and intent. He had lured Fanny away with money. He had taken steps to isolate her. He had attempted to conceal evidence afterward. He had written about the killing in his diary, calmly enough to date the entry. These were not the actions of a man unaware of right and wrong. Even Baker's own conduct after the murder worked against him. Witnesses described how he tried to deflect suspicion, offered misleading information during the search, and maintained a facade of normalcy. Such behavior, prosecutors argued, demonstrated calculation, not madness. A truly insane man, they told the jury, would not attempt to cover his tracks. The judge was blunt in his instructions. A family history of mental illness, he explained, was not proof of insanity. The law required clear evidence that Baker did not understand what he was doing, or that he did not know it was wrong. No such evidence existed. Eyewitness testimony also played a central role in the prosecution's case. Minnie Warner and Lizzie Adams, both young girls at the time of the abduction, recounted the events of August 24th with clarity and conviction. They described Frederick Baker's initial attempts at persuasion with small sums of money, the sudden act of force in which he seized Fanny, and his subsequent disappearance. Additional testimony came from Thomas Gates, the laborer who had discovered Fanny's remains, and from neighbors who had confronted Baker and observed his suspicious behavior in the hours following the abduction. Physical evidence further solidified the prosecution's case. At Baker's office, authorities had found 2 small knives, clothing stained with blood, and a diary entry. 24th of August, Saturday, killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. This document removed any ambiguity about intent or awareness of the crime, providing a written confession in Baker's own hand. Moreover, a young boy later came forward with corroborating testimony, stating he had observed Baker washing his hands in the river, disposing of 2 small objects, and was covered in blood on the day of Fanny's death. The trial proceedings, which began on a chilly December morning, were intense but remarkably brief. Baker's calm and collected demeanor did little to mitigate the weight of the evidence against him. The jury needed only 15 minutes to reach a verdict. Baker was found guilty of the murder of Fanny Adams. The sentence, pronounced in Winchester, was death by hanging, in accordance with English law at the time. Frederick Baker's execution was scheduled for Christmas Eve, 1867, in Winchester. Reports indicate that over 5,000 people attended, drawn by both public outrage and morbid curiosity, a common occurrence for high-profile executions in Victorian England. Baker wrote a letter to Harriet and George Adams expressing remorse and seeking forgiveness before his death. On that cold December day, justice, albeit grim, was served. But there is one missing element here: motive. Put simply, we don't know. Unlike ordinary crimes of passion or theft, the murder of 8-year-old Fanny Adams had no apparent rational purpose. He did not rob her, he did not have a personal grievance, and he did not target her for revenge. The violence he inflicted was extreme, deliberate, and calculated. This was clearly a premeditated murder. But why? Modern criminologists speculate that Baker may have been driven by sadistic impulses, a desire for control, or other psychological compulsions. Some have wondered whether he could have been a latent serial killer, with Fanny Adams being the first or only victim whose crime was discovered. In Victorian England, fragmented policing, poor record-keeping, and the absence of profiling meant that earlier or subsequent murders could have gone unnoticed. Back in Alton, life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy, though the psychological scars of Fanny's murder remained. Harriet and George Adams, shattered by the loss of their daughter, buried Fanny in Alton Cemetery, close to the home she had known and the fields she had played in. The headstone was erected through voluntary subscription, with townspeople contributing to ensure that Fanny's memory would not be forgotten. Shortly after Fanny Adams' murder in 1867, sailors from the British Royal Navy began mockingly comparing their unappetizing tinned mutton rations to her remains. Over time, the phrase "Sweet Fanny Adams" evolved into slang, meaning nothing or worthless, detached from the horrific tragedy that inspired it. Honestly, the phrase is deeply offensive when one remembers the bright, innocent child behind it. Rather than reducing her memory to a cruel joke, we should honor Fanny Adams for who she was: a joyful, curious 8-year-old whose life was tragically cut short, and let her story be remembered with dignity and compassion. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.